President Trump is actively and aggressively trying to end the Russia-Ukraine war. He has been putting the strong arm on Ukraine to agree to a 30-day total ceasefire, which before they weren't. And now he's trying to put pressure on the Russian side to also agree to that. Vladimir Putin has conceptually said he agrees to it, but he's got some pretty heavy conditions that he's placed on it, a lot of questions he's asking, which leads one to wonder, is there really going to be a ceasefire? Now, one of the things that's driving President Trump, which certainly we at this channel have been in agreement with from the beginning, all the way back through, from the beginning, all the way into the Trump administration, from the Biden administration, and we're really glad to see that he's focused on the human condition. One of the things that he talked about just this morning as evidence of that is that, as we've been talking about, the Kursk incursion that Ukraine had been holding since August of last year has totally collapsed. And there's one small pocket left where there's apparently several hundred Ukraine soldiers still trapped inside. And the Russians apparently have them cut off. President Trump is concerned about their well-being. And he posted a Truth Social this morning where he brought their issue up. He said, "We have very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin with Russia yesterday, and there's a very good chance that this horrible, bloody war can finally come to an end. But at this very moment, thousands of Ukraine troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military in a very bad and vulnerable position. I have strongly requested the President Putin that their lives be spared. This would be a horrible massacre, one of the worst since World War II. God bless them all." And that is consistent with what Trump has, what has been driving him, is this horrible loss. And he's always been clear about saying the losses on both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians. He views the war as unwinnable and it shouldn't have been fought. He said many times, had he been president, this war would almost certainly never have started. I happen to agree with that for very practical diplomatic reasons, but it doesn't matter. That it did happen, it is underway, and now he's trying to get the thing over. The previous administration ignored all of those realities and continued to foster the war and to keep it going and to feed it, even though any rational person could have seen that it was unwinnable, yet they were oblivious to the cost to the Ukrainian side. Well, now Trump is not. And in fact, he at a speech yesterday with Mark Rutte from the Oval Office, he emphasized again why he is so focused.
We're going to be discussing a lot of things. Obviously, we'll be discussing what's happening with respect to Ukraine and Russia. At this moment, we have people talking in Russia. We have representatives over there, Steve Witkoff and others, and they're in very serious discussions. As you know, Ukraine has agreed, subject to this, what's happening today, to a complete ceasefire, and we hope Russia will do the same. Thousands of people are being killed, young people, usually, mostly. Young people, we were just talking about it. Thousands of young people are being killed a week, and we want to see that stop. And we have to get this war over with, and you'll be back to a normal, much more normal life, and maybe we're close.
And yeah, he's hoping we're close, because in Jeddah last week in Saudi Arabia, Trump got a concession out of the Ukraine side that they were up to that point unwilling to have a full ceasefire. Zelensky had said very plainly that he doesn't want a ceasefire on the ground. I never completely understood the logic. He wanted one on the sky and to see which were the areas both of biggest control to him, but he's losing territory on the ground and troops on the ground. So I wasn't clear why it would ever be in his interest to not have the ground included, but Trump got it out of him. And after that meeting, Zelensky himself acknowledged and said, yes, we'll go and agree to a full 30-day ceasefire. Now we have to go to the other half of the equation, and that is on the Russian side. So the question is, what is Russia's motivation? Now, as we've been telling you for a long time, for months, because this idea has been out there for a long time, that the war at some point is going to have to end in a negotiated settlement. The question has always been, will it start with a ceasefire and then have negotiations where no one's being killed? Or will there be negotiations during the fighting, and then once they agree to something, then it would be stopped? Well, it was very clear what the Ukraine side would have preferred. And again, the Biden administration didn't even broach the subject. But since Trump has been in, he obviously wants a ceasefire to stop the killing first. But now Russia is playing a little bit of hardball here, and they're maintaining the consistency, because up to this point, they have categorically said there won't be. In fact, it was as recently as 3 weeks ago, one of the Russian senior officials said that we will not have a ceasefire. You've seen me put from December, where Sergei Lavrov said a truce is a road to nowhere. We're not going to do it. We'll talk, we'll negotiate, we'll continue to work on the details, but we'll not stop. Well, that seemed to have a bit of a subtle change when Vladimir Putin initially said, I'm open to the idea. I'm considering it, but there's some caveats that go with it. There's some nuance was a word he used, which I think is not quite the right translation or definitions are in order here, because the concessions that he's talking about are a little more than nuanced. They're actually quite considerate. Well, Trump was asked just at an interview last night what he would do if there isn't a ceasefire.
What's the plan if Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire?
Bad news for this world, because so many people are dying, but I think he's going to agree.
And believe me, nobody wishes that more than I do, and I hope that he's able to do it. There obviously are things that we don't know that are going on behind the scenes. As I mentioned in a show yesterday, there are some potential sweeteners that Trump could put on the table. He does have some leverage. He does have some cards to play, but he doesn't have the power cards, which the Russian side does have. And to kind of give an example of just how Putin himself is thinking, he said this at an interview. I think it was the day before yesterday.
Then the question arises: how will issues of control and verification be resolved? How can we be assured, and how will it be guaranteed to us that nothing like this will take place? How will control be organized? I hope that, at the level of common sense, this is clear to everyone. These are all serious questions. And who will be giving the orders to cease hostilities? And what is the value of these orders? Just imagine almost 2,000 kilometers. Who will determine where and by whom a possible ceasefire agreement has been violated along these 2,000 kilometers? And then, who will be blaming whom for violating this agreement? These are all questions that require thorough examination from both sides. Therefore, the idea itself is correct, and we certainly support it, but there are questions that we need to discuss.
Now, so he again reiterates, I'm open to it, I'm willing to discuss it, but there are some questions. Now, as a little background, some of the things, actually many of the things he mentioned in there are actually because of from the Russian perspective, bad experience from the Minsk Agreements back in 2015. Because in those cases, some of those issues were not resolved. They had a ceasefire first, and then they were working on negotiating details. And a lot of those things were left off the table, so they didn't get them answered. And now then Russia is saying up front that, okay, before we even agree to a ceasefire, we're going to have these big issues resolved here first. And a few of them are, as you heard him saying there at the beginning of that clip, he's looking for guarantees. The Russian side says before we'll agree to a ceasefire, we have to have some kind of guarantees that this is going to go in a direction that we want. Some of the specific issues there are who is going to be controlling the organization of these things. So there has to be some sort of infrastructure, some sort of bureaucracy that's agreed to by all parties that's going to monitor this. It's going to control it. He said, this front from the Kursk area and now probably the Sumy area, it's very soon, it's not going to be Kursk anymore because that's going to be reestablished. And the front's now going to be, as in parts it already is, in the Sumy Oblast of Ukraine. So from the Ukraine front all the way around to the Kherson area down in the south, he says it's about a 2,000 kilometer front. So he says that's a big area to monitor. And he says, who's going to be monitoring that? And then who's going to be responsible for violations? That's one of the big issues that they had that was omitted from the Minsk Agreements, is that there was no penalties for violations. And the OSCE was involved in that one. They were monitoring a lot of this stuff, and they would announce when there had been ceasefire violations, but there was no enforcement mechanism really for either side. And there were violations going back and forth. Later in this process, in the early part of 2022, actually before Russia invaded, the violations on the Ukraine side went sky high and went through the roof on artillery violations, which not many in the West actually want to talk about anymore, but the information is still out there on the web. You can certainly Google that, the artillery violations by the OSCE that were monitored at that time. But it doesn't matter if you accept that or not, Russia believes it. And the fact is they aren't going to agree to a ceasefire unless they can get those issues resolved and get them issues resolved in ways they like. Now, we need to understand right now, that's not something that's going to happen quickly. And the fact that Steve Witkoff, who flew to Moscow and stayed less than 24 hours and came back without making a statement, is pretty strong evidence that we're not that close to an agreement. Because I can only imagine that behind the scenes, the Russians are probably asking maybe even more than that, or saying, hey, we have some pretty high standards here that the U.S. side so far is not willing to acknowledge, because that's going to be some pretty big asks. And to give in to everything Russia is asking for is going to make the U.S. side and the Ukrainian side look weak. And you know Trump doesn't like to look weak. So he's trying to find some way to get this done where some of his leverage can work. So that's why I'm sure that behind the scenes, he's not saying anything against this. Trump isn't. I would imagine that he's probably trying to find some sweeteners that would not be unpalatable or too unpalatable for many in the West, but that might be enough for Putin to say, all right, we can live with that as long as A, B, and C, X, Y, and Z, whatever all his other terms are. I think it's going to be a very, very high hurdle to clear. And I have doubts that the Russian side even want to have a ceasefire, despite what Putin's saying. I think there's more and more evidence growing that they don't want one. One of the issues on the table that Putin just mentioned there was who's going to monitor the ceasefire violations, who's going to monitor this 2,000-kilometer front. Well, one group seems to think, hey, I could do that. I know who that is. And that is the European Union Plus, this coalition of the willing. At the moment, there are 37 members of that, and they're going to be meeting in, I think it's Paris tomorrow. So they're saying, hey, we'll do that. We'll meet with that, and we'll provide and I've mentioned this before, some of the comments coming out of the European side is we'll have a robust peace enforcement force. So they won't just be peacekeepers with blue helmets and rifles, but they'll have full military kit to enforce whatever peace. Now, I'm sure that on the surface, they would say, yes, that'll extend to both sides. We'll patrol this 2,000-kilometer front. And if Russia violates it, we'll do something to them. And if Ukraine violates it, we'll do something to them. Not thinking that's going to work out too well. And in fact, if anybody has any doubts about it, definitely don't take my word. But how about the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov?
If NATO expansion is recognized, at least by Donald Trump, as one of the root causes, then the presence of the troops from NATO countries under any flag in any capacity on Ukrainian soil is the same threat.
You won't accept it under any conditions?
Under any conditions, well, nobody is talking to us. They keep saying nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, but they do everything about Russia without Russia.
So he's saying unequivocally, anybody who has a NATO patch on their shoulder, any country from or any soldier from a country that wears a NATO patch under whatever flag, under whatever patch, if that troop is from a NATO country, he said they're disqualified. So they're not going to agree to that. Maybe they would agree to something with the OSCE, somebody who's not a member of NATO, maybe some other country. So even categorically, they're not necessarily opposed to any kind of peacekeeping forces or enforcement mechanism of some sort, but that's only going to be on the line that they prefer. And by the way, this related to something we said at the top where Trump is saying, hey, I want you guys to not kill these people. This just popped on my phone, like during that clip that was played there on Telegram by Dmitry Medvedev from the National Security Council in Russia. He says, moments ago at a meeting of the permanent members of the Russian Security Council, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief said, if the Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region lay down their arms and surrender, we will guarantee them their lives and dignified treatment. This is a very humane approach by our country, but for the Ukrainian Nazis, there is also a flip side. Should they refuse to lay down their arms, they will be systematically and mercilessly eliminated. The bloodthirsty Kiev regime still has a chance to save its people. In the coming hours, we will see what they have chosen. So on the plus side there, President Trump's plea has been answered. The Russian side is saying, we're willing to do that. We're willing to do what you've asked as long as they lay down their arms and surrender. And listen, folks, if I was a Ukraine soldier, that's exactly what I would do. That's not empty bluster because they have them in the pocket right now. They can make good on this right here, and they can move through and systematically destroy them all. They basically got them cut off, not just under fire control, but apparently something close to being physically encircled in a pocket inside the Kursk area. So kudos for President Trump, because his diplomacy there is reaping some opportunities. Now, it just remains to be seen whether the Ukraine side will accept that deal and will follow through with something to keep their people alive. And that's a theme that I've seen a lot, and I have worries that they won't do it. I really hope to be proven wrong on that, because that's one of the motivations of President Trump. And apparently the Russians are willing to concede to that. Any possibility of getting even small scale things like this, an agreement that turns into something that's positive, that moves towards peace and keeps people alive, we need to seize it, because every positive thing has the possibility to build to the next positive thing. But if those things are rejected and thrown away, then we go backwards. And now then the position's hardened, because what's really important to understand in all of this, Russia is in the military, economic, and production capacity pro side. They're in the advantage, irrevocable advantage. So that's important when you understand who can do, because if Trump wants this and tries to push hard for this, but he doesn't have the leverage to compel it, and the Russians can have the ability to say yes, or they have the power to compel no, and that they can go down another path, and there's not power to compel a stop on the other side, you see where this is likely to go. That's just the history of armed negotiations going back millennia. It doesn't matter whether the Spartans back in the thousands of years ago or these people here today that are, like right now, the fundamentals, the human fundamentals, the military fundamentals have not changed in that regard. Now, I want to look at one of the other things here, because that was the issue. One of the peacekeepers. That's a big one, because the European Union is putting a lot of effort to get his 37-member alliance that has almost no chance of actually going in there, but they're going down it anyway, thinking that somehow, I don't know, that Russia's going to agree to something that's not to their advantage when they have the power to prevent it. But there's another issue, that some people want the current line of contact to be the end, or they say maybe even the June 14 lines. I think that there's certainly an element in the Trump camp that says, look, those administrative borders of those 4 regions, big chunks of them, especially the southern 3, are still in Ukrainian control. And to have an agreement, Ukraine is going to have to be willing to abandon that, to withdraw back to those administrative borders. That's going to be a tough ask. But here's the problem. Even at those administrative borders, that doesn't change all of the dynamics for the Russians, because there are demographically a whole bunch of other ethnic Russians still on the other side of even those administrative borders. And Sergei Lavrov gave notice that has not passed their notice.
And the second thing is the rights and the fate of the people who live not only on the liberated territories, but on the territories under the control of the regime. They also, most of them, speak Russian. They were brought as part of the Russian culture, and they want their kids to know Russian and to learn Russian. My question was whether this law, or several pieces of law, prohibiting Russian language, whether this would be cancelled on the territory which would be left of Ukraine. There is no answer. We'll see later.
Now, one of the things when he says these several laws, what he's referring to is in the run-up to the February 2022 war, and in the months. So into 2021, Ukraine started changing their laws, which obviously violated the spirit of the Minsk Agreements themselves and moved further away from it, even at that time, where they systematically stripped the rights of the Russian-speaking citizens inside the country. They denied them rights. They denied them the ability to speak their own language in any official capacity. They couldn't read and write in school, etc., and other places as well. So these were systematically repressing the Russian population, which was one of the reasons cited by the Russians as to why they intervened in the first place. That was one of the big ones. So now Lavrov is saying we're still paying attention to that. And so he says, yeah, there's the June 14 lines, but even on the other side of the June 14 lines, there is a large number of Russians. Now, you may recall that a couple of weeks back, I think we had Austrian Colonel Mark Reisner, who showed that one of the possible ends, if there's no ceasefire, was that the Russians could go all the way to the Dnieper River and even southern part of that to take all of the area up to the Moldovan area and the Transnistria area, which would include Odessa, because there was a lot of ethnic Russians living in that area. So that's been a key point to Russia, not ever far from their eyes, even though it's never on our radar at all. But so that leads to the question, will Russia be satisfied with this if they don't get those changes? Sergei Lavrov said, are they going to change their order, their constitution, which was also part of the aborted Istanbul Agreements in 2022, and the big part, the number one part of the Minsk Agreements that were never accomplished by the Ukrainian side. They were obligated to change their constitution to get rid of those things and give limited autonomy to the Russian speakers in the eastern part of Ukraine. That never happened. Since that time, since the war started, there's even bigger constraints on them. So here's the question. If Russia doesn't see that the Ukraine side is willing, it's part of a ceasefire negotiations even, and certainly as part of a negotiated settlement, that they would change their constitution and give the rights back to the Russian speakers on their side of the line, one has to wonder what would happen next. Now, to get an idea of whether the Ukraine side is aware of this and what they're thinking, we don't have to wonder. One of their members of parliament said this a few days ago.
In my personal view, there are three things. First is our territorial integrity de jure, meaning that occupied territories, Ukrainian territories by Russians, yes, they will be controlled by Russians after the end of hostilities, at least part of them, but they are Ukrainian territories. That is very important for us to keep this non-recognition policy, because one day the last colonial empire in Europe will fall apart, speaking about Russia, and Ukraine will regain control over territories. Number two is sovereignty, meaning that Ukraine makes its own choices about what army to have, what military production to expand, and what alliances to join. This is very important. Number three is security guarantees, meaning that, first of all, definitely from European Union and European countries, meaning what will prevent Russia from attacking again. So these are three things, again, territorial integrity de jure, sovereignty, and security guarantees, which I think should be our red lines.
Yeah, your red lines. So you're telling Russia pretty straightforward, we're not going to change our laws. We're not going to change our constitution. We're not even going to give away our territory. We're going to stay with, we may allow you to control them for a time, but only with the caveat that we are going to get them back through diplomacy later. And by the way, we're going to maintain the ability to have alliances, straight up alliances, not neutrality, but we will decide whether we want to have alliances the fourth, and then we're going to get security guarantees from the West. Categorically, Russia refused all of those things, and one could make the argument that all three of those things were some of the big drivers for why Russia started the war in the first place. So even after now into the fourth year of war, where everything has gone against the Ukraine side, where they've lost probably north of 1 million soldiers, continue to lose them by the thousands every week, there is no prospect that the U.S. is going to continue supporting this war. On what rational basis should anyone in the Ukrainian government be making red line declarations to the side that has been winning this war and has the capacity to completely destroy itself, the other country? There is no one. Trump has been emphatic that he's not going to compel by force of arms or anything else Russia to do this. They may put some more sanctions on. They may turn even more support on later. I doubt that, but that's at least a possibility. But you've seen that with no holds barred, all the support from the U.S. and the European side has not stopped the loss of the Ukraine side. So by any rational estimation and analysis, The Ukraine side can see that with even marginal support from the U.S. and much less none, there is no hope. So then why then would you want to tell Russia when they are signaling clearly they're looking beyond the 14 June lines, that you're not going to do the one thing that could prevent Russia from doing that? If the Ukraine side agreed to that, and if that was part of even a ceasefire negotiation, guarantees up front that Russia's looking for, it could be that even at this late hour that Russia could be satisfied with only going to the 14 June lines. But if they don't get that assurances, I think that it's likely, not even possible, but likely that Russia will militarily go beyond that. And a signal was sent just the other day with an apparent leaked document that was discussed on Fox News by Rebecca Koffler, who we've had on our show before here. She's written the book, I think, The Putin Playbook, has dedicated most of her life to understanding how the Russians think. And here's what she said yesterday on Fox News.
But there was also a leaked document, Rebecca, showing Russia's plan is to prolong this war for years, past 2026. Russia, of course, denies that. Do you believe that ultimately what's in that plan is their plan?
99.9%. I mean, remember, in Putin's playbook, my book, I laid out very clearly what Putin's playbook is, his strategy, which is a multi-pronged strategy that he spent a quarter of a century developing. Okay, and we remember 3 years ago, we were here on the show and you asked me, Todd, how do we stop Putin's playbook? And what was my answer? I said, it was almost impossible. Why? Because I know that we don't have a counter strategy. Every single war game that we conducted back in the intelligence community ended up in Russia winning the war. And neither us nor the Europeans never bothered to develop a counter strategy, even though 10 years prior to the invasion, we knew about it.
So there's Rebecca Koffler talking. She used to work in the CIA, by the way. Some of those war games she was talking about were no kidding, actual conducted. And you heard her say it. They all came out with the Russians on top. Now then, Russia's even stronger than when those war games were crafted, because those were done in a dynamic before this war started, when Russia was at its position where it was heading into February 2022. Now then, they're substantially stronger in every category. So again, any kind of rational analysis would say, why would Russia agree to terms to its disadvantage when it has the power to compel compliance? That is at the heart of this whole issue right here. Now, you may say, that's Rebecca Koffler. That's just somebody from this side of the pond, and they're reading articles or whatever, and that's their conclusion. Okay, they used to work at the CIA, but still, that was a long time ago. But that's not the case right now. And Russia, I think, is hurting bad. I keep hearing this. Russia's hurting bad. Their economy's on the brink. Their military is at the point of exhaustion. They just can't go on much further. So they need an end to this war. Well, if you don't want to believe Rebecca Koffler, maybe you'll listen to a very prominent and former direct confidant, still confidant to both Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin, used to be a Kremlin advisor, who said this on BBC.
I just want to check what the aim of Russia is here. Is the aim to come to some kind of deal on Ukraine, or is the aim to ensure the capitulation of Kiev?
First of all, the best, the possible outcome is, of course, total capitulation of Ukraine and Europe. We have to finish this war one way or another, and I hope that what was left of Ukraine would be totally demilitarized and neutralized, and live in peace. They could be and not used as a spearhead against Russia. If not, if it would be used, the war would resume.
So you see him point blank. This war has to be concluded to Russia's advantage. They are said, he even said there, and he paused for dramatic effect. He said, our best case scenario is the total capitulation of Ukraine and Europe. At first he had he said Europe and meant Ukraine, but then he stopped and added back in Europe. So his point is, there is certainly not going to be any armed European peacekeepers inside Ukraine, ergo on the Russian border. with wherever the dividing line is going to end up. That's not even on the possible list of things that the Russians would agree to. But you can see that Karaganov here, without blinking, without hesitation, without embarrassment, our objective is to see the complete capitulation of Ukraine and the defeat of Europe. Now, it's unclear whether he means the political defeat or he means a military defeat. I think it's pretty clear that Russia does not want to go to war with the European Union. But more and more, we're seeing the possibility, especially as Europe has this big rearm program that they're going to have, adding $800 billion to their defense industry up through 2030. Everybody from Germany to the Baltics to several other countries that have been warning their people, we're getting ready for war with Russia. There's every incentive for Russia not to agree to any kind of end of negotiation settlements, much less a ceasefire per se, that will leave it in anything except the strongest possible position. So you have Vladimir Putin saying that conceptually, I'm willing to have a ceasefire. And I think that he means that. I do. But the conditions that he laid out there, and especially when you get into the denazification and the demilitarization, which have not left their lexicon, that's not off the table. You see that for them to have a ceasefire, they're saying as long as you meet all of our conditions, which I think in this point is right from the Volodymyr Zelensky, who said Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. He just wants the surrender of the Ukraine side. That's what he has said. And I think I have to agree with him here. I think that is what Putin is asking for. So the difficulty for the White House is going to be, if you're trying to get a ceasefire to end the war here and you want it on terms favorable to Kiev, that's not likely to succeed. So the question is going to be, what's going to happen next? Where is this going to end up going? And right now, I don't have an answer to that. And it's unclear, how this can play out any way other than what the Russians are saying that they want, because they have the power to make it happen. We're going to have to wait and see. Again, there's things going on behind the scenes I don't know about. Diplomatic things between the United States and Russia I don't know about. Hopefully Trump has some cards that we're not aware of that can make this end in some other way less than that. But the big thing is this needs to end, and it needs to end quickly, because the longer it drags on, the worse it's going to be for Ukraine and the worse it's going to be for Western interests. So in this case, even a bad deal for the West, it ends the war, is probably the best we're going to get right now, and something I would advocate. We'll see how it works out. You can count on Daniel Davis Deep Dive to stay with you on top of it, and we'll keep you updated as things continue to happen, like we did with this one from Dmitry Medvedev, which showed there is some possibility of Trump's actions actually turning into something beneficial on the ground. We'll continue to watch it, but in the meantime, thanks for watching. We appreciate you guys very much. Like and subscribe if you haven't done so on your way out. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.